I had never been afraid of the woods before. As a child, I spent hours running through forests, letting the trees swallow me whole, finding comfort in the thick blanket of leaves above. The smell of damp earth and pine was as familiar as the scent of my mother's cooking. But that night, something was different. It started just after sunset. The cool breeze, which had felt refreshing when I first set off, had turned into something colder, something unsettling. I had gone for a hike alone, something I had done countless times before. But tonight, the forest felt like it was closing in around me, like the trees were leaning in, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one here. The path beneath my boots was uneven and covered in moss. The trees towered overhead, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I had been walking for hours, lost in my thoughts, my mind as deep in the woods as my body. The sun had slipped completely behind the horizon, and the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It wasn't just the absence of light that made me uneasy. It was the way the shadows moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of my vision. I thought it was nothing more than the wind rustling the trees. But as I continued deeper into the woods, the flickering became more deliberate, like a shadow was following me. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. But I knew something was wrong. My heart began to beat faster, and I forced myself to shake it off. The further I walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, the silence around me pressing in like a weight. I couldn't hear any animals. No birds, no insects, not even the occasional rustle of leaves as small creatures moved through the underbrush. It was as though the forest had suddenly held its breath. I stopped and took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. There was a clearing up ahead, and I decided to make my way toward it. Maybe I just needed to sit down for a minute, take a break, and clear my mind. But as I approached the clearing, I felt it again, the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone anymore. I stepped into the clearing, the soft crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots the only sound. The moon was full tonight, casting pale light across the grass and the trees surrounding the clearing. For a moment, I let myself relax, but then something caught my eye, movement, just beyond the trees at the edge of the clearing. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I swallowed hard. It was probably just an animal, a deer maybe, or a fox. I took a few more steps forward, my eyes scanning the shadows, still feeling that nagging sense of being watched. My breath came out in short gasps, and I began to feel like I was no longer alone, that the forest was alive in ways I couldn't understand. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and I found myself unable to shake the sense that the forest was changing around me. I glanced back toward the path I had come from, hoping to make my way back to the relative safety of familiar ground. But as I turned, something made me freeze. The path was no longer visible. The trees had grown taller, their trunks thicker, their branches twisting in unnatural ways. The clearing, too, had changed. It felt smaller now, as if the trees had crept closer without me noticing. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, too. It wasn't just the usual layer of dead leaves and moss I had walked on. It was soft and spongy, like the earth itself had begun to shift. I took a step back, panic rising in my chest. The moonlight was still there, but now it felt distant, as though the world around me had been cast into a shadow that stretched just beyond my reach. I spun around again, but the clearing was no longer where I had thought it was. The trees had taken over the space, and the path I had walked on was completely gone. I stumbled backward, the air suddenly thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I had to get out. I had to, but then I heard it, a sound, so faint that it might have been the wind, but there was something in it, something different, a rustling, as if something large was moving through the brush just beyond the trees. I stopped, holding my breath, came again, closer this time. The sound of something dragging its feet through the undergrowth, a heavy, deliberate pace. I stood motionless, my heart thundering in my chest, my body locked in place. I had to move. I couldn't stay here. I turned sharply to my right, trying to orient myself, but the moment I took a step, the sound stopped. I froze. There was no wind, no rustling leaves. The silence returned, even heavier than before. My body tensed, my muscles aching from holding still for so long. My head whipped around in every direction, but I saw nothing. Only trees, shadows, and the dark sky above. The trees were closing in again, their trunks so thick now that they seemed to merge with each other. The air was growing colder, and I could feel it creeping under my skin, wrapping itself around my bones. I turned around and ran. I don't know why I ran. I didn't even know where I was running to. I just knew I couldn't stand there anymore. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, the earth shifting beneath my boots, and I stumbled again and again, each time getting up quicker, moving faster. I couldn't think about anything except putting distance between myself and whatever it was I had felt in those woods. The path was gone now. The familiar landmarks I had passed earlier all vanished. The trees around me felt like they were moving, pressing in tighter with every step I took. I ran until my chest burned, until my legs screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't. Suddenly, I broke through the trees and found myself in a small ravine. The forest opened up around me, but there was no way out. The ground was too steep, the climb too dangerous. My only option was to keep moving, to press forward, but the dread, the feeling of being followed, of being hunted, was too much. I turned around, panting, looking back over my shoulder, half expecting something to be standing just behind me. But the space was empty. The forest was still, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it all. But then I heard something, a crack, sharp and unmistakable, from somewhere above me. I looked up. The tree branches above me shifted, and someone, stepped into view, just on the edge of the cliff. I couldn't see their face, just the shadow of a figure, hunched and waiting. Their presence was so wrong, so foreign, that my body froze in place. There was no mistaking it now. The forest was alive, and it was not alive in any way that I understood. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground. The last thing I remember was the figure's eyes, gleaming faintly in the moonlight, before everything went black. When I woke, the forest was quiet again. There was no sign of the figure. No sounds, no rustling of leaves, no signs of anything having been there at all. I stood slowly, the ache in my body from running still there, and I looked around. The trees were back to their normal, familiar positions. Took me hours, but I finally made my way out of the woods. My legs were shaking, my body exhausted, but I had made it. The sun was rising as I stumbled out of the forest, the last remnants of night still clinging to the trees. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never set foot in those woods again. The feeling of being watched, the sense of something out there, something watching, something waiting, it had been real, and it would stay with me forever. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never would be again. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to go out there alone. Maybe I wanted the quiet. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. But I shouldn't have done it. It started as just another hike, something I'd done 100 times before. I had planned a 2-day solo trip deep into the mountains, far from the usual trails, carrying only what I needed to get through the night. The forecast was good, my pack was light, and I felt confident. I had my map, my GPS, and enough food and water to last me through the trip. The first few hours were perfect. The sun was out but not too hot, and the air was cool in the shade of the trees. The trail was rough but manageable, winding through thick pines, with patches of exposed rock and loose dirt. I walked steadily, feeling good about the pace I was making. I had planned my route carefully, making sure to stick to paths that, while not heavily traveled, were still well documented. By mid-afternoon, I had made it further than I expected. I stopped to eat a granola bar and drink some water, checking my GPS against the map. Everything lined up. I took a moment to appreciate the silence. No cars, no voices, no sounds except for the occasional bird and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then I made a mistake. I saw what looked like a shortcut on my map. A small, unmarked trail branching off from the main path. It seemed to cut straight through the valley, shaving a good hour or two off my route. It looked fine on the map, and I figured it was probably an old logging road or a forgotten hiking path. So I took it. At first, it was easy enough to follow. It was narrower than the main trail but still visible, winding downhill into a dense patch of trees. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The wind died down and even the birds seemed to disappear. But I didn't think much of it. I was making good time, and I was sure I'd be back on the main trail before sunset. Then the trail started to fade. What had been a clear path turned into a mess of underbrush, loose dirt, and scattered rocks. I hesitated, checking my GPS again. The signal flickered, struggling to keep up with the tree cover. I waited for it to correct itself, but it just spun, searching for a connection. I should have turned back, but I didn't. Instead, I kept going, thinking I could reconnect with the trail if I just pushed a little further. The ground was uneven, sloping downward at a steep angle, covered in fallen leaves and rotting wood. My boots slipped a few times, but I caught myself, grabbing onto trees as I went. Then the ground gave out. I didn't fall far, maybe 6 or 7 feet, but I landed hard. My right ankle twisted under me, sending a sharp, blinding pain up my leg. I yelled out instinctively, but the sound was swallowed by the trees. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing through the pain, trying to assess the damage. My ankle hurt, but I could still move it. Probably just a bad sprain. But the real problem was my position. I had fallen into some kind of gully, surrounded by steep, muddy slopes. The way I had come down was too slippery to climb back up. I tried my GPS again. Still no signal. Panic started creeping in, but I pushed it down. I had supplies. I had a map. I just needed to get my bearings and find a way out. I scanned my surroundings, looking for an easier way up. The gully stretched ahead, curving out of sight. I figured if I followed it, I'd eventually find a spot where I could climb out. So I started walking. Every step sent pain through my ankle, but I gritted my teeth and kept moving. The gully twisted and turned, the walls growing steeper on either side. The ground was damp, covered in slick mud and patches of moss. Tree roots jutted out from the banks, some big enough to grab onto, but none sturdy enough to climb. I checked my watch. Almost 5 p.m. The light was starting to fade. That's when I found the first sign that something was wrong. A boot print, not mine. It was half buried in the mud, the edges softened by moisture, but it was fresh. Someone else had been here, recently. For a second, relief washed over me. Maybe there was another hiker out here. Maybe I wasn't alone. But then I looked closer. The print was deep, heavier on one side, like whoever made it was carrying something or limping, and it wasn't going in the direction I was heading. It was coming from deeper in the gully. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I kept moving, slower now, listening to every sound. The forest was still eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then I saw the second footprint, and the third, and then something worse. Piece of fabric, caught on a low branch, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Faded, torn, stained. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. It was probably nothing, just a lost hiker who had come through before me. But something about it felt wrong. I kept going, moving carefully, scanning the ground ahead. Then I found the backpack. It was half buried in the mud, the zippers open, one strap torn. I hesitated before crouching down, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle. I brushed away the dirt and pulled it free. It was old, but not too old. The material was still intact, though waterlogged. I unzipped the main compartment. Empty. I checked the side pockets. Also empty. No ID, no food wrappers, no sign of who it had belonged to. Just a backpack, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Something was very, very wrong. I stood up slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed to get out of here. Now, I kept moving, forcing myself forward despite the pain in my ankle. The gully was getting deeper, the air colder. The walls were starting to close in, the trees overhead blocking out the last of the daylight. Then I smelled it, a sharp, rancid stench cutting through the damp air. Rot. My stomach turned. I didn't want to see what was ahead, but I had no choice. I rounded the bend and stopped. There, tangled in the underbrush, was a body, or what was left of one. The clothes were shredded, the skin dark and bloated. The hands were gone. The face was barely recognizable. Animals had been at it. I staggered back, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't an accident. Someone had left this person here, and I was not alone. I turned and ran. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't care. I pushed forward, scrambling up the side of the gully, grabbing at roots, clawing at the dirt. I could hear something behind me. Footsteps, fast and heavy, closing in. I didn't look back. I reached the top and threw myself over the edge, landing hard. I got to my feet and limped forward, heart hammering. I had to find the main trail, had to get out. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A sliver of light through the trees. The trail. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I burst onto the path and didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, until I couldn't breathe, until I was sure, absolutely sure, I wasn't being followed. I never found out who that body belonged to, or who had left it there, and I never ever took a shortcut again. I had been camping since I was a teenager. It was never anything extreme, just a way to escape for a few days, to be somewhere quiet. I wasn't a survivalist or anything like that, just someone who liked the woods. This trip wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just 3 nights out in the forest, alone. I had done it plenty of times before. There was a stretch of land about 100 miles from where I lived, mostly untouched, deep enough that I wouldn't see another person the entire time. It wasn't an official campsite, just public land that didn't see much foot traffic. The last time I had been out there was almost a year ago, and I remembered thinking how peaceful it was. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a small hatchet, my knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and my rifle. I didn't always bring a gun on camping trips, but this area was remote. I had never seen a bear out here, but I wasn't about to be caught off guard. The drive took most of the afternoon. I followed the highway until it turned into a smaller road, then finally a dirt path that wound through the trees. My truck handled it fine, but I could feel every bump, every dip in the road. Eventually, I reached a spot where I had parked before, just a small clearing off the path. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the silence. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees. I grabbed my pack and locked up the truck. The hike in was only a couple of miles, but the terrain was rough in places. No real trails, just old deer paths cutting through the undergrowth. I had my GPS, though, and I wasn't worried about getting lost. Took about an hour to reach the spot. A small clearing, maybe 20 yards across, bordered by thick trees. A shallow creek ran nearby, which meant I wouldn't have to use much of my bottled water. I had camped here before, and it looked the same as I remembered. Undisturbed. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to have some cover but far enough that nothing would fall on me if a storm rolled in. After gathering firewood, I started a small fire and cooked some food. The air was crisp, colder than I expected, but the fire helped. As the sun dipped lower, I sat by the fire and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was mostly quiet, an occasional rustling in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. Normal sounds. I didn't feel uneasy, not yet, but something was different. Took me a while to put my finger on it, but then I realized. The woods were too quiet. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that even at night, the forest is never completely silent. There are always insects, small animals moving in the brush. But now there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the wind through the trees. I told myself it was fine. Maybe the temperature had dropped just enough to keep the bugs away. Maybe the wind had shifted, making it harder to hear the usual night sounds. Still, I kept my rifle close as I crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep well. At some point in the night, I woke up, not to a sound, but to the absence of one. The fire had burned down to embers, and outside, everything was still. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. Then I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps. Not an animal. Something heavier. They stopped just outside my tent. I reached for my rifle, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, barely daring to breathe. Nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe more than that. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, moving away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal. No broken branches, no footprints. I started to wonder if I had imagined it. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. Still, I felt uneasy. I spent most of the day trying to shake the feeling. I gathered more wood, checked the area for any signs that someone had been nearby. But there was nothing. By evening, I had convinced myself it was nothing, just paranoia. Then, as I was sitting by the fire, sharpening my knife, I noticed something. The trees just beyond the clearing, something was there. Not moving, just standing. Couldn't make out details. It was too far, and the light was fading. But there was a shape. Human. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, staring into the trees. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward. The shape shifted, almost like it was stepping back into the darkness. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, my rifle across my lap. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard things. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just the wind, but I knew better. At some point, just before dawn, I heard something behind my tent. A deep, slow breathing. Not mine. I turned, gripping my rifle, but by the time I crawled out of the tent, there was nothing there. That was enough. As soon as it was light, I packed up my gear. I didn't bother eating, didn't bother cleaning up the campsite. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking. The whole way back, I felt it. That presence. That sense of being watched. I moved fast, my heart pounding with every step. The trees felt closer than before, the air heavier. Then, just as I reached my truck, I saw something. Footprints, leading from the tree line, barefoot, large. They stopped a few feet from my truck. Whoever, whatever, had been watching me had come close. Too close. I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees, watching. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to that forest. Hiking alone had always been my thing. Some people needed company, but I didn't. I liked the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being truly alone with nothing but my own thoughts and the rhythm of my footsteps. It was my way of escaping the noise of everyday life. I had done more solo hikes than I could count, ranging from short day trips to week-long treks deep into the wilderness. I knew what I was doing. I was careful. I planned my routes. I carried the right gear. I told people where I was going. That's why, when I decided to hike a remote section of forest deep in the Appalachian Mountains, I wasn't nervous. I was excited. It wasn't a marked trail, just a forgotten path I had read about in an old hiking forum, mentioned only in passing. A rugged, overgrown stretch of wilderness that hadn't been maintained in years. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck on the shoulder of a narrow dirt road, miles from the nearest town. There was no official trailhead, just a gap in the trees, barely visible unless you knew where to look. I slung my pack over my shoulders, adjusted my straps, and stepped into the woods. The first few miles were easy enough. The trail was faint but still there, winding through dense forest, the ground soft with damp leaves and moss. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in scattered beams, lighting up the dust in the air. It was quiet, peaceful. I moved steadily, keeping an eye on my GPS to make sure I was staying on course. The terrain got rougher as I went, the path narrowing, the underbrush growing thicker. I had to climb over fallen logs, push through tangled branches. By midday, I had covered about 8 miles. I stopped to rest on a large, flat rock overlooking a narrow valley. I pulled out a protein bar, took a long drink from my water bottle, and checked my map. So far, everything was going as planned. I should have turned back then. I didn't. Instead, I pressed on. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees here were massive, their trunks thick and gnarled. Their roots twisted across the ground like veins, forcing me to watch my step. The air smelled different, earthy, damp, but with something else underneath, something stale. The quiet grew heavier. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, deep in the soft earth, leading in the same direction I was going. Someone else was out here. I hadn't seen another vehicle near the road. No signs of recent human activity. No campsites, no trash. Just these prints. Large, deep. I kept moving. The trail began to drop in elevation, leading me into a hollow. The trees here were even older, their branches arching high above, blocking out most of the light. The air was cool, almost cold. My breath came out in faint wisps. Then I noticed something else. The forest floor, the leaves, the twigs, the moss. It was disturbed, not just by footprints, by something else. The ground looked wrong, like something heavy had been dragged through here. I told myself it was nothing, just wind, just erosion. I kept going. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing, perfect spot to set up camp. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore muscles, and took a long drink of water. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was overthinking everything. I forced myself to eat. I gathered some wood, built a small fire. The warmth was comforting, the light pushing back the creeping darkness. But the feeling didn't go away. I felt watched. The fire crackled. Shadows flickered across the trees. The night pressed in around me, thick and silent. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Close. I froze, heart pounding. Something was moving in the trees. Heavy, slow, not an animal. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle tight. I listened. Nothing. Minutes passed. I forced myself to breathe. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, another sound. Footsteps. Deliberate. Close. Then silence. I sat there, gripping my knife, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing moved. No more sounds. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed up and started hiking back. Fast. I moved quickly, my legs burning, my heart pounding. The feeling never left me. The sense that I wasn't alone, that something was following. I kept looking back, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I could feel it. The air was heavy. The silence was worse than before. I pushed forward, harder, faster. I was about 2 miles from the road when I saw it. A figure, standing just off the trail, far enough that I couldn't make out details, close enough that I knew it was real, tall, motionless, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't run. I just walked faster, forcing myself to keep my breathing steady. I reached the road. I saw my truck. I didn't look back. I threw my pack in the bed, jumped in, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, my hands gripping the wheel, I finally looked in the rearview mirror. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I never went back. Hiking alone had never scared me. I'd been doing it for years. I liked the isolation, the quiet, the way the world felt simpler when it was just me, my pack, and the trail ahead. I knew how to handle myself, how to read a map, how to ration supplies, how to respect the wilderness. But no amount of experience prepares you for everything. This trip wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just a 3-day trek through a remote section of national forest. I had planned my route carefully, 26 miles in a rough loop, following an old logging road before cutting through deep forest to connect to another trail that would take me back. The map showed no significant hazards, no rivers to cross, no extreme elevation changes, just dense woods, overgrown paths, and solitude. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck at a small, empty lot near the trailhead. There was no one else there. No other vehicles, no signs of recent activity. Just me, my gear, and the quiet stretch of forest ahead. I locked up, slung my pack over my shoulders, and stepped onto the trail. Day 1, the first miles were easy. The trail was worn but visible, winding gently through towering pines. The ground was soft underfoot, a thick layer of damp leaves and pine needles cushioning my steps. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, breaking in long, golden streaks across the forest floor. It was perfect. I moved steadily, making good time. A few miles in, the trail became rougher, the trees closing in, the undergrowth thickening. I had to push through tangled branches, step carefully over exposed roots. By midday, I reached the old logging road. It was barely recognizable, just a faint path cutting through the trees, overgrown with grass and small shrubs. The air smelled different here, older, damp earth and rotting wood. I checked my map. This was where I needed to veer off, cutting into the deeper woods to connect to the next part of the route. There was no official trail, just a faint track that past hikers had used. I followed it. The forest thickened. The trees were massive here, their trunks gnarled and weathered, their branches twisted high above, blocking out most of the light. The air grew cooler. The silence was heavy. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing. I pushed on. An hour passed, then another. The trail became harder to follow. The undergrowth grew denser. I stopped often, checking my map, making sure I was still on course. Then I saw the first sign that something was wrong. The ground ahead was disturbed, not in the way that hikers disturb it. The leaves, the pine needles, something had moved through here, something big. I crouched, studying the ground. The soil was churned up in strange patterns, as if something heavy had been dragged. I scanned the trees. Nothing. The uneasy feeling settled deep in my gut. But I told myself it was nothing. Just an animal. A bear, maybe. I kept going. By late afternoon, I found a decent spot to set up camp, a small clearing near a dry creek bed. I pitched my tent, gathered wood, and built a fire. The glow was comforting, pushing back the creeping darkness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I felt watched. I forced myself to eat, forced myself to sit by the fire, to listen to the sounds of the night. But the forest was silent, and that silence was worse than any sound. Day 2, I woke early. First, everything seemed normal. The fire had burned low but was still smoldering. My gear was untouched. Then I noticed something. The ground. The disturbed area I had seen before? It was closer, as if something had moved through the woods while I slept. I scanned the trees. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I packed up quickly and started hiking. The trail, if you could even call it that, was almost non-existent now. I relied entirely on my map and compass, moving carefully, double-checking my direction at every turn. But something was wrong. The land didn't match the map. I should have hit a small ridge by mid-morning. It wasn't there. I should have crossed a shallow stream. There was no water. I stopped, checked my bearings. Somehow I was off course, but I hadn't made any wrong turns. I had followed my route exactly. The uneasy feeling grew. I turned back, retracing my steps. But the landscape felt different. The trees, the undergrowth, things weren't where they should have been. Then I saw the second sign. A tree, its trunk stripped of bark in long, jagged streaks. Deep, claw-like gouges cut into the wood. Bare markings? Maybe, but something about them felt off. I kept moving. The further I went, the more signs I found. More stripped trees, more churned-up ground. Something had been moving through these woods. Something big. I picked up my pace. By midday, I was sweating despite the cool air. My pack felt heavier. The silence pressed in around me. Then I found the footprints. Not mine. Not a bear's. Human. But wrong. Too large. Too deep. The steps were spaced far apart, as if whatever had made them was moving fast. I turned and walked faster. My heart pounded. My breathing came hard. The trees blurred past. Then something ahead. A shape. A figure. Standing deep in the shadows between the trees. Watching. I stopped. My chest tightened. My legs burned with the urge to run. But I didn't move. Neither did it. Seconds passed. Then it stepped back. Melted into the trees. Gone. I ran. I don't remember how far. How long. Just that I didn't stop until I saw my truck. I practically threw myself inside, locked the doors, started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I looked in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the tree line, watching, I never went back.